You could smell it all even before reaching the back porch. That was the smell of Grandpa's citrus trees, heavy with fruits that seemed unbelievably large and bright. Years may have passed since then, but his secrets to growing these big juicy fruits haven't. That wisdom, these citrus secrets, are a legacy worth preserving. So let's take a walk down that memory lane. Let's sit under the shade of a lemon tree and revisit the 25 secrets Grandpa used to grow the biggest, juiciest fruit I've ever known. Picking the right varieties. You see, Grandpa knew something that modern gardening sometimes forgets. You can't grow a great orange from a mediocre tree. Truth is, not all citrus trees are created equal, which means picking the right varieties remains the most important secret. The difference between a handful of sour, lumpy fruit and a basket full of sweet, juicy sunshine. And here's why. Some varieties, like the Meyer lemon, can take a bit more chill and still produce juicy fruits, while others, like the Valencia orange, thrive best under steady, warm sun. Knowing your local climate and matching it with the right variety means healthier trees and better fruit. Grandpa's wisdom was simple. Don't just plant any citrus variety. When you choose a specific variety, you're not just buying a plant. You're selecting for flavor, for season, for resilience, and for memory. You're making a decision that will echo for decades in the fruit you harvest. Always remember that. The secret of good drainage. Grandpa would usually start his tour not by pointing to the most laden tree, but by stomping his boot on the ground. "Listen to the earth," he'd say. "It tells you everything." The first and most non-negotiable rule in your garden kingdom is all about where you put your citrus thrown. And that's where the beauty of good drainage comes into play. Citrus, regardless of the variety, always demands one thing: well-drained soil. Grandpa's favorite spots were always on the gentlest of slopes, even if he had to create a small mound himself. Fungus and rot love a stagnant puddle more than anything, and you have to be determined to give them no quarter in your grove. Avoid frost pockets. Grandpa had a way of making the invisible visible. On a crisp, still autumn morning, he'd lead me to the lowest corner of the yard, where a ghostly blanket of fog had settled in the night. He taught me that the secret to sweet, juicy fruit wasn't just in the feeding, but in the simple, profound act of putting them to bed in the right spot, which means avoiding frost pockets however possible. His solution was simple, yet brilliant. He planted his most tender citrus, like the limes and young saplings, just a little further up the slope. You see, just a few feet in elevation can make the difference between a light frost and a killing freeze. This careful placement was his way of working with the elements, not against them. And now, it's yours too. Avoid shady areas. Fun fact, citrus trees are sun worshipers, not shade seekers. I can remember Grandpa always said this with a smile on his face, wiping the sweat off his face. He was a sun worshiper himself. He knew that citrus trees, like him, needed a full day's worth of sunshine to truly thrive. When we went for walks, he'd point to trees struggling to produce fruits, and they all had one thing in common. They were planted in shady areas. Well, this means that before putting your citrus seeds in the ground, make sure you found that ideal spot where from sunrise to sunset, not a single shadow from a house or a large oak would fall across the leaves. A tree stuck in the shade, especially the deep shade on the north side of a building, would always be weak, susceptible to pests, and a poor producer. It was a lesson in not fighting a tree's nature. Choose the right soil. I can still see him, crouched down, crumbing a handful of earth between his fingers. He had a reverence for soil that I didn't understand as a child. To me, it was just dirt. To him, it was a living, breathing universe. Choosing just the right soil will ensure that your citrus trees are always blooming with juicy fruits. Here's the thing. Citrus roots need to breathe almost as much as they need water. A heavy clay soil that turns into a sticky mess when wet is a death sentence, suffocating the roots and inviting rot. On the other hand, pure sand drains too fast, leaving the roots thirsty and starved of nutrients. So, you need a perfect balance. A gravelly loam, a mix of sand, silt, clay, and organic matter. Grandpa knew that if he got the soil right, everything else, the health, the vigor, the flavor, would follow naturally. Flea monoculture. Grandpa's grove was a chaotic mess to the untrained eye. It wasn't rows upon rows of identical trees like you'd see in a commercial orchard. To him, that was an invitation for trouble. His design was a tapestry of different citrus, oranges, lemons, grapefruits, kumquats, all intermingled with other trees and shrubs. One of Grandpa's biggest citrus secrets was fleeing monoculture. And here's the thinking behind this. If an insect or disease specialized in attacking, say, lemon trees, it could hop from one to the next in a straight line, devastating the entire crop. But in a diverse garden, a pest looking for a lemon tree would have to navigate through a grapefruit, past a fig, and around a pomegranate. Along the way, it's likely to be eaten by a predator, simply get confused and give up, or spotted by you. Diversity was his first and best line of defense. And within this community, he had a specific, powerful pattern he loved to use. Design your orchard using trios. This was where Grandpa's design genius really shone. He didn't just plant trees randomly. He planted in what he called trios. I can see him now, sketching in the dirt with a stick. Yep, it was all so well thought out and structured. He explained that these trios were like little families. The nitrogen fixer was the provider, bringing food to the table. The fruit tree was the star, producing the bounty. And the shrub filled in the space, suppressing weeds and creating a beneficial microclimate. The trees in his trios were always lusher, greener, and more productive than any isolated tree. A powerful lesson in partnership you can now practice. One of the beauties of using trios is it solves the problems before they even become a problem. Plant it all at once. When Grandpa decided to plant a new area, he didn't just put in the trees and call it a day. You've got to strike while the iron is hot, he'd say. And that means planting the entire system. The trees, the shrubs, the perennial ground covers, all at once. If you planted just the tree and waited 5 years to add the shrubs, the tree's roots and canopy would already be established. The shrubs would then have to struggle to compete for light and water, and they'd never catch up. But by planting everything together in the beginning, they all start on a level playing field. They grow up together, their roots intertwining and their canopies forming a cohesive, multi-layered structure from the start. When in doubt, space them out. I remember helping him plant a new orange tree. I had the measuring tape, and according to the book, we could space them 12 feet apart. Grandpa looked at the number, then looked at the sky, and added 3 more feet. He believed that crowded trees were unhappy trees. They fought each other for light, water, and nutrients, and their lack of air circulation made them a magnet for fungal diseases. So, when in doubt, space them out. Generous spacing, while space-consuming, is a gift of air and light. It means each tree can develop a full, rounded canopy without bumping into its neighbor. This ample airflow keeps the leaves dry and healthy, drastically reducing the need for any kind of spraying. It also allows walking freely in your orchard. I remember all those afternoons when we'd gather under Grandpa's orange tree, and he'd tell stories of him and Grandma's past. Memories that wouldn't have happened if his orchard wasn't so open. For small spaces, use dwarf rootstock. Grandpa had a huge yard, but with all the spacing out he did, he still needed more space. So, on his patio, in large terracotta pots, he grew the most delightful collection of dwarf citrus. An improved Meyer lemon, a kaffir lime, a calamondin orange. This is a citrus secret for you, small space gardeners. Leverage dwarf rootstock. A dwarf tree isn't a lesser tree. Number, it's simply a full-sized variety grafted onto a rootstock that limits its size. The fruit is identical in size and flavor to that on a full-sized tree, but the tree itself might only grow 6 feet tall. This makes it manageable for harvesting, pruning, and protecting from frost. This choice is all about working smart, not hard. It required less water and fertilizer than a giant tree. proof that you don't need acres of land to experience the joy of growing your own food. Stagger harvest times. Grandpa didn't want a fruit avalanche. He always wanted a steady, manageable harvest from spring through fall. So he carefully selected his varieties. He had an Owari Satsuma that ripened around Christmas, a Washington Navel Orange for the new year, and Valencia oranges that wouldn't be ready until late spring or early summer. This staggered approach meant that instead of being overwhelmed with hundreds of oranges all at once, burdened with the task of having to finish them all before they went bad, we had a constant fresh supply for over half the year. It also spread the work of harvesting, making it a pleasure instead of a panic. It was a lesson in kitchen management as much as orchard management. Never stop experimenting. Even with decades of experience in the garden, Grandpa never stopped learning. He always had this spot out back, his test corner. This is where he'd try a new variety of finger lime from Australia or a strange citron used for religious ceremonies. "You never know," he'd say with a twinkle in his eye, which brings us to one of his best-kept citrus secrets. Never stop experimenting. This spirit of curiosity kept his gardening young. It was a recognition that there was always more to learn, always another possibility. Sometimes the experiments failed, and that was okay. He'd learned something from the failure. But when one succeeded, when he found a new cultivar that thrived with utter neglect and produced incredible fruit, it was like striking gold. This way, his garden was never static. So, go out there and evolve. You never know what you might learn. Avoid amending the planting hole. Here's one of Grandpa's rules that most contradicted common gardening advice. When he planted a new tree, he'd dig a hole. Then, he'd carefully place the tree in the hole and backfill it with the exact same soil he'd just dug out. No compost, no peat moss, no fertilizer. Nothing. He saw amending the planting hole as creating a comfort zone that the roots would never want to leave. Here's the thing. If you make the planting hole too cozy, the roots will just circle around in that rich pocket of soil like a pet goldfish in a bowl. They'll never venture out into the native soil to anchor the tree properly. Therefore, by using the native soil, you're encouraging the roots to spread out aggressively from day one in search of nutrients and water, building a wide, stable foundation for the tree. Sometimes your tree needs a little tough love to grow even stronger. Dig a big hole. The holes Grandpa dug weren't deep. They were cavernous. Why? Well, because you aren't just making a home for the roots that are there now. You're making a home for the roots that will be there in 5 years. By loosening the soil in a wide area around the tree, you're removing physical barriers to growth. So he'd usually spend hours breaking up the walls of the hole with his fork, creating a soft, easy path for young roots to penetrate. This initial investment of effort meant the tree would establish itself in half the time. The roots could grow outwards quickly, tapping into soil moisture and nutrients instead of being confined to a small, hard-packed hole. Tend the top, not the hole. So, you're probably wondering, if all the good stuff didn't go in the hole, where did they go? On top. After the tree was planted and watered in, Grandpa would spread a wheelbarrow load of rich, finished compost or well-rotted manure in a wide circle over the root zone, like topping a pizza. Then, he'd cover that with his mulch. Why? Because that's how nature does it. Leaves fall, fruit falls. It all decomposes on the surface. When you put amendments on top, the nutrients are slowly washed down into the soil by rain and irrigation, exactly the way the tree's feeder roots, which are near the surface, like to consume them. A gentle, slow-release system that mimicked natural forest cycles, not force-feeding the tree with root zone fertilizers. Mulching after planting. The mulch blanket was Grandpa's signature touch. After planting and top dressing with compost, he'd lay down a thick 6-inch layer of straw, shredded leaves, or wood chips. He treated this blanket with the same reverence some men reserve for a perfectly manicured lawn. He'd meticulously pull the mulch back a few inches from the actual trunk to prevent rot, but then he'd pile it on thick everywhere else, This blanket is a miracle worker. It conserves water by reducing evaporation, suppresses weeds by blocking their light, feeds the soil as it slowly decomposes, and insulates the roots from extreme temperatures. Talk about versatility. It was the single greatest time and labor-saving technique in his citrus gardening Bible. But the job isn't done yet. Renewing this mulch blanket every fall or spring is a non-negotiable maintenance chore. Avoid staking small trees. Most gardeners believe in staking. Grandpa, though, not so much. He believed it made trees weak. A tree needs to sway in the wind, he'd insist. He believed that was the only way it could build a strong trunk. So, here is what he did. For trees smaller than he was when they were still growing, he'd plant them and leave it completely freestanding. You know that gentle rocking of the wind? Well, it stimulates the trunk to grow thicker and stronger to resist the movement. A staked tree, by contrast, often grows tall and spindly, with a trunk too weak to support itself when the stake is eventually removed. His rule was simple. If the tree is so tall it might snap in a strong wind, then a short-term stake is okay. But it was always a temporary crutch, never a permanent fixture. Use a tree guard. The garden is full of some hungry critters. To a rabbit or a vole, the tender, sugary bark of a young fruit tree is a delicacy. Grandpa knew that a single rabbit could girdle and kill a sapling in one hungry winter night. So his final act of planting was to secure a tree guard. His guards were simple, durable cylinders of hardware cloth or perforated plastic. He'd push them a couple of inches into the soil to stop burrowing voles and have them extend high enough to deter rabbits. These guards are like a suit of armor for the tree's most vulnerable part, its trunk. He'd leave them on for the first 3 to 5 years until the bark had thickened and toughened enough to no longer be appealing. This is a small, simple bit of insurance that prevents catastrophic loss. Mow grass infrequently. Your orchard isn't a lawn. I know Grandpa's certainly wasn't. Instead, it was a meadow, and what that means is that he let the grass and clover and wildflowers grow long and lush. He'd only mow the aisles between trees a few times a year, and he'd often do it in sections. Why? Well, simple, for the bees and butterflies. By always leaving some areas in flower, he ensured a constant supply of nectar and pollen for the beneficial insects that pollinated his trees and ate the pests. That long grass in your orchard is a habitat, a sanctuary. Rolling it instead of mowing is an even better option as it lays the grass down flat without destroying the flower heads. This lazy approach to mowing is, in fact, a highly strategic wildlife management technique. Sometimes you just have to farm insects as much as you farm fruits. Apply the 80-20 rule, Pareto's principle. Are you familiar with Pareto's 80-20 principle? Well, it's more of an economics rule than a gardening rule, but Grandpa still made full use of this principle out back. He was a master of efficiency, and you too can become just as efficient. Here's how. This is how Grandpa used the 80-20 rule in the garden. 80% of his harvest was coming from 20% of his plants, and conversely, 80% of his problems were coming from a different 20% of his plants. So, what you now have to do is identify that troublesome 20%. Was it a plum tree that always got scale insects? A spot in the garden that stayed too wet? Identify and focus all your energy there. By focusing your limited time and energy on the critical few areas that made the biggest difference, you can avoid getting bogged down in the trivial many. Grandpa never ran around putting out every little fire. He was preventing the big ones from ever starting. Train trees. While they're young, Grandpa spent more time with his young trees than with his mature ones. Before that young one can become that giant tree you've envisioned, you've got to spend hours on end taking care of that young one. Grandpa was always gentle. His tool of choice wasn't a pruning saw, but a piece of soft string and a few old weights. He'd gently tie branches, guiding them to grow at a wide, welcoming angle from the trunk. Growing up, he always explained that a narrow, upright branch would always be weak and would only produce leafy growth. A wide-angled branch, however, was strong, able to hold a heavy load of fruit, and was hormonally triggered to produce fruit buds instead of water sprouts. This early training was an investment that paid off for the entire life of the tree. A well-trained tree will require far less corrective pruning later on. Its structure would be sound, its fruit accessible, and it would be a thing of beauty. The arboricultural equivalent of teaching a child good manners. It makes everything that follows much easier. Practice good sanitation. After the last fruit was picked, Grandpa's work wasn't done. He'd make weekly rounds with a bucket, diligently gathering every single fallen fruit from the ground. This was strategic pest control. Why? Because that's where the bugs sleep. Here's the thing. Many insects, like codling moth larvae in apples or certain beetles in citrus, overwinter inside the fallen fruit. If left on the ground, they would emerge in the spring, crawl right back up the tree, and start the cycle of damage all over again. By removing and composting or destroying this fallen fruit, you are breaking the pest's life cycle right at its most vulnerable stage. Weed or transplant unwanted plants. Even in Grandpa's well-designed system, volunteer plants would often appear. A bird would drop a blackberry seed, or an oak would sprout from a forgotten acorn. The concept of weeding isn't foreign to any gardener. Nevertheless, Grandpa's approach to these weeds was a bit more nuanced. If it was a true weed, he'd pull it. But if it was a useful plant, a seedling citrus tree, a volunteer shrub, he saw it not as a problem, but as a free gift from nature. What does this mean? He kept a collection of small pots and a shady nursery bed for just this purpose. When he found a valuable seedling, he'd carefully dig it up, pot it, and nurture it until it was strong enough to be planted in a permanent home or given away. Why buy a new tree when Mother Nature is planting them for free? This way, weeding becomes less of a chore and more of a treasure hunt. Despise weeding like I do, then take this page out of Grandpa's gardening Bible. Always mark your plants. In the lush green chaos of a productive summer garden, a small fruit tree sapling can be easy to miss. Grandpa had a few horror stories to tell. My cousin once mowed down my entire new planting because he forgot where I put them, he'd laugh, shaking his head. To avoid such catastrophes, you have to be a meticulous marker. Every new tree and shrub should get a durable, clearly written tag on a tall, sturdy stake. It mustn't be fancy, but it is effective. This simple act of labeling ensures that when you or anyone else is mowing, weeding, or working in the garden, they know exactly where the precious new plants are. It's a cheap and easy bit of insurance. Always look beneath your trees. Grandpa's garden was always expanding and rarely from a nursery. He was constantly on the lookout for volunteers, seedlings that had sprouted from fallen fruit or were planted by birds. Under his plum tree, he'd find dozens of plum seedlings. Around his citrus, he might find seedlings that, while not true to the parent fruit, could be used as hardy rootstock for grafting. This is common. Now, these volunteers aren't weeds, but free plants. By regularly being on the lookout, you can spot these volunteers, carefully dig them up, pot them, and grow them on. In a couple of years, you'd have a new tree to plant or even give away. You'll be able to increase your plants tenfold and without having to spend $1 more. And all you have to do is keep your eyes open. Grandpa's secrets weren't about secret recipes or magic potions. They were about a way of seeing the world. His grove was a testament to the abundance that emerges from a healthy system. If you're familiar with any of these secrets or have some of your own, tell us down in the comments section. Hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed today's video. Until next time, my green-thumbed friends.